Your colleague, the Northern Ireland Secretary this morning, was essentially trying to say that these fines, or the fine the Prime Minister has faced personally, is akin to a speeding ticket or a parking fine. Is that how you see it?
Well, technically, he's correct. It is. It's a fixed penalty notice. But clearly, it's a lot more serious than that, because I think if the Prime Minister had been caught for speeding, nobody would be calling for his resignation. But having said that, I mean, I personally believe that he genuinely did not know he was breaking any rules, because he didn't go out to an event and party like famously two broadcasters from Sky News did, and I'm very curious to know whether they're going to get fixed penalty notices. But he operated from within his work premises, and of course a senior civil servant also involved with the maintenance of discipline in Number 10 was also, I don't think she's been fined, I don't know, but certainly she's admitted to being at one of these parties.
In saying that, I mean, the reason we say, obviously, of course, that it's not an equivalence in many ways is because we were told that you had to stay at home to save lives. You know, Matt Hancock, the Prime Minister's Health Secretary, at the time, during the third lockdown, said that every time you try to flex the rules, that could be fatal. It could be fatal if you flex the rules. And that's why it is more serious, isn't it? But in the end, the Prime Minister should have known this. I mean, this is the weird thing, though, is in he came up with these rules. If he didn't know what the rules were, how the hell were the rest of us meant to know?
Well, the whole basis of the rules, and the Matt Hancock point that you gave was very good, actually, because the whole point of the rules was not to spread disease, to spread contagion. But of course, he was working cheek by jowl with these people anyway. So you're working in offices together. And I said earlier on parties, but actually, when is a party a party? I mean, if you have a cup of tea with people, is that a party? If you have a glass of lager with them, you know,
but in saying that,
party? I think
Michael, in number 10 is a big building. You and others have pointed that out. There are different departments, but in different parts of that building, actually, they don't always come together. When people do come together, you're right, the virus had the ability to spread. So, for example, if it turns out that people, well, it's going to turn out that people were invited by one of the most senior civil servants in Downing Street to all gather in the garden, which the Prime Minister then attended, or indeed if it's proven that he has gone to a party that's been organised, that it goes beyond simply working cheek by jowl. Under those circumstances, then you would expect the Prime Minister to face further sanction, maybe even to resign, surely.
Well, I know people think that I blindly follow the Prime Minister. I don't blindly. I have other areas of criticism of Boris Johnson. But I do have huge sympathy because, you know, you talked about meeting in the garden, meeting open air. And, for example, that infamous photograph, which was taken from Number 11, of the Prime Minister sitting with his wife and two other people, quite separated in the garden, and rather dour groups of 3 or 4 spread out in the garden, I think he might well have taken the view that this wasn't going to cause contagion. And as I say...
Well, yeah, but people were told they weren't allowed to sit on benches in parks at the time.
Senior civil... Because of the delay, it's not a good idea if you interrupt me because it talks over me. I just wanted to say senior civil servants obviously didn't think they were breaking rules either. Over.
OK, well, we're going to see what the Prime Minister says in just over an hour's time. Let's move on to the Home Secretary, because we're also going to hear from Priti Patel, aren't we, Michael, at around 3:30. We're just going to talk about this plan to send refugees and economic migrants to Rwanda. Do you agree with the Archbishop of Canterbury at the weekend, who said that the plan was ungodly?
Well, I think as well he thought that God, wouldn't agree with it. I mean, I'm hugely impressed that we now have an Archbishop of Canterbury who actually does know what God thinks, because many of his predecessors thought that God's intentions were wondrous. But I don't want to get too much into theology here. The bottom line is it would be interesting to know what alternative he's suggesting. Does he think, then, that the people smugglers are a good idea? Does he think that it's rational for people to escape France to go to Britain? Is France such a bad place to live?
So some people are suggesting that we should have processing sites in France that we should have these sites in Calais, so we process people there. I don't know. Is that an idea you think the UK government should pursue?
We have done that. We did that. We did that at Sangatte, which is was a major camp near Calais. The problem was that those people who were processed and then didn't get permission to go still then tried to make it illegally across the channel. The Rwanda thing is to try and deter people from going to people smugglers and then getting onto these incredibly dangerous boats, which is a reckless move, a desperate move, and try and stop them from even wanting to come or attempting to come to the UK because they know they will then go to Rwanda. I mean, my hope is that very few people will go to Rwanda because when people over in France realize that that's what's going to happen to illegal immigrants, then, they won't even attempt to cross the channel.
Well, I mean, they could do. They just might not declare themselves when they arrive on the beach.
Or get caught, yeah.
Well, yeah, lots of them don't. And that feeds into my next point. One of the reasons, and you and others argue lots of these people trying to cross the channel are economic migrants rather than refugees. So one of the reasons they don't stay in France is because there's not really much of an informal economy. They've got an ID card system, which means it's quite difficult to get work in France unless you've got a form of ID. That's not the case here. Many people say you would almost solve this problem. The easiest thing to do, solve it overnight, is if we had an ID card system in this country, which means it would be much more difficult for these people, economic migrants, to simply go undercover, go into the black economy, if you like.
Well, yes. In fact, I was just shifting around there because I was going to show I've got an ID. I'm not sure I'm supposed to show it on television, but that's my House of Commons ID. Look, I remember voting. Tony Blair, I think, tried to introduce ID cards, and lots of Labour MPs as well as Conservative MPs voted against it because, we just felt this is not the sort of thing that a liberal country like the United Kingdom has. But Darren, if you were right, and I just don't know, if ID cards meant that it would stop migrants from travelling across, I'd be willing to trade that off and vote for ID cards. But I'd have to be pretty convinced that that would stop these illegal migrants.
Well, you heard it here first. We may come back to that at some stage. Just very finally, Michael, just on the issue of immigration, before we have to wrap it up. I mean, are you still beholden? Is the Conservative Party still beholden? I mean, clearly they're not. But, I mean, do you think it's an issue of regret that migration is not down to the tens of thousands, as had been promised, of course, by both David Cameron and Theresa May?
Yeah, I mean, I've never been anti-migrant, to be honest with you. And I was a rabid Brexiteer and over the moon when we voted to leave the European Union. But I did that because of the sovereignty issue. It wasn't because of immigration. But clearly we've got to control it. I mean, we don't want large classes in schools. The health service is under pressure. We can't have uncontrolled migration. By the way, don't forget on this Rwanda thing, I don't know whether the Archbishop of Canterbury thinks that Israel and also Denmark are ungodly, but both those countries, Denmark at the moment and Israel did, have an agreement with Rwanda to do just precisely what we're planning to do.
And we know that Israel abandoned it after it was proven that only 8 of the refugees they'd sent were still there, because most of them had left, and that may well be the case here. No, the reason I ask about the overall number is because new figures show that there were 240,000 work-related visas granted last year, compared to 25% that was higher in 2019, i.e. the numbers are going up. The number of migrants moving to Britain legally is going up. Are you happy that it is in those figures, 240,000 people arriving in the last year?
Well, I represent a rural constituency. Lichfield is a cathedral city and we're surrounded by farms and rural area. And it's been a real problem getting fruit pickers and others. So actually where we have a shortage of labour, good plumbers, You know, I mean, really, I don't know why English people or British people don't do it, but where we have a shortage of labour, yeah, it's perfectly legit. Look, you know, Britain's got one of the fastest growing economies. In fact, I think it's the fastest growing economy in the G7, certainly faster than the rest of the European Union. So providing that we can accommodate, in the broadest sense of the word, providing schools, homes, hospital facilities and whatever, for the population that comes in and give them jobs, you know, it strengthens all of us if, you know, we've got a large number of people in employment. But, you know, this is a small country geographically. It's only half the size of France. So, you know, there has to be some sort of limit.
OK, I'm just going to, on the economic growth, I think that was for 2 quarters last year. Certainly in the first quarter this year, it can claim to be the fastest growing economy in Europe or indeed in the G7, given how slow growth was. And the IMF in the last half an hour have issued new predictions for next year, which the UK will be the worst performing economy in the G20, just above Russia, apparently. There we go. But have a look into that, Michael. We'll come back to talk to you again. As always, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.